So, hello and welcome to our presentation this evening, Beneficent's Women of Muncie Contribute to the Community. This is a community collaboration between the Ball State University Libraries and Muncie Public Library. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available.
I think I accidentally muted you, Sarah. There you go. Sorry about that. I was trying to admit somebody and it muted.
Okay. Since this is a virtual live presentation, we have muted everybody. We will have time for questions between each segment and at the end of the presentation. If you wish to ask questions, you can use the chat box. The button to access the chat box is located in the toolbar located at the bottom of your screen. When using the chat box, please make sure that the To field is labeled to everyone. This is where all the participants can see the questions. If you wish to ask your questions vocally, please open up the participant button, which is also located on the toolbar, and click the blue hand raise button, and I will unmute you so you can ask your question. So right now, before we jump into the presentation, I'm going to ask that everyone who is able can enter into the chat that they can hear me and can see our presentation slide. So we've got a couple of yeses. All righty. So I think the presenters, well, actually, let me go ahead and do some introductions when you can see our pictures. So my name is Sara Allison. I am the head of Archives User Engagement at Ball State University Archives and Special Collections. This evening, we will be hearing from Sara McKinley, who is the Local History and Genealogy Supervisor of Muncie Public Library and manager of the Carnegie Library. Lindsey Vesperry is the Archives Collection Specialist for Local History at Ball State University Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections. She is currently a student in the IUPUI's Master of Library and Information Science program. Melissa Gentry is the Supervisor for GIS Research and Map Collection and the founder of the Notable Women of Muncie and Delaware County Committee for the Delaware County Historical Society. So we're going to start with Sara. So Sara, take it away.
Right. I'm just going to turn off my camera here for a second. All right. First slide, please. Okay, so I'm actually going to be covering two women during this presentation, and the first woman I'd like to talk about is Hattie Patterson. Next slide, please. I had always been interested in researching Hattie because she was the city of Muncie's first librarian, and she worked actually just across the street from where I work now, which is the Carnegie Library, where we archive her reports, her correspondence, and some of the books that she cataloged. Unfortunately, there are no known photographs or images of Hattie herself, so I've done my best to illustrate her life with articles, documents, and maps. Hattie Patterson was born Harriet Louisa McCracken in 1835 in Ohio. As an adult, she married William Patterson, and their attempts at starting a family were met with several tragedies. Both of her daughters died before reaching their first birthdays in 1858, and their son also died as a child. Shortly after that, their strength was tested further by the Civil War. William was away from home serving in the military telegraph service. After the war ended, William returned a Civil War veteran, and they moved to Bellefontaine, Ohio, where William worked for the Beeline Railroad. By 1870, Hattie and William moved to Muncie, and William became manager of the Western Union Telegraph Office. Next slide. "4 years after the Pattersons moved to Muncie, The citizens of the city had recognized that Muncie was in need of a public library. Since 1853, the county had struggled to maintain county or township libraries, and the only place to borrow books in 1874 was the Muncie Post Office. So the school superintendent, Hamilton S. McRae, organized citizens to form a stock company to finance the creation of a city library and reading room. Hattie herself was one of the original stockholders, purchasing a $2 share. This is her stock certificate in the Muncie Public Library's archives. Next slide. Hattie was hired as the city's first librarian when the Muncie Public Library opened in a room of the city building in 1875. The city building, which no longer stands, was located at the northwest corner of Jackson and Jefferson, which is the direct opposite corner of where the Carnegie Library stands today. Next slide. So here's a view from the 1883 Sanborn map that shows the city building with the tower on the corner. The building contained the fire engine house on the lower level and the library on the upper level. So I imagine it was a bit noisy sometimes in the reading room. If you compare it to a present day Google map, the red square where the city building used to be is the corner of the parking lot of First Merchants Bank downtown. And then southeast in the blue circle is the Carnegie Library, which opened in 1904. Next slide. Hattie's salary at the library was only $250 a year, which is less than $6,000 a year today. So she was also allowed to sell stationery in the reading room to supplement her salary. She served as librarian for 6 years from 1875 to 1881. In one of her reports to the board of directors, she stated, "When I took charge of the room in 1875, its contents were 1 dozen chairs, 1 table, 1 newsboard with 6 papers. She had the enormous task of sorting and cataloging over 2,000 books and carefully labeling, classifying, and shelving them. On the first day of business, she served 91 visitors, mostly boys and young men, but also a few young women who came to read. By the end of her 6 years as librarian, she had registered over 1,550 borrowers and was loaning more than 20,000 books annually. When her service ended in 1881, she was even a candidate for state librarian." Next slide. One of her activities outside of being the public librarian was to become a founding member of the Women's Club of Muncie. The club was organized in 1876 at the home of Emma Montgomery McRae, the wife of the school superintendent, Hamilton McRae, who helped organize the public library. The Women's Club was one of the pioneer clubs of its time in the United States. At the time of its founding, many preferred to call it a reading circle and were hesitant to call it a club because similar groups of women across the country were receiving ridicule for their advanced ideas on women's suffrage. But ultimately, they did vote to call it a club. The original objective of the club was pretty broad. It was to present practical methods for improving the mental, moral, and physical condition of society, and to secure, as far as possible, united effort toward the higher civilization of humanity. They later revised and simplified the objective to be the social and intellectual advancement of women and united effort to further improvement in the community in which we live. Over her years of membership, Hattie was actively involved in the club and served as secretary and treasurer. Next slide. Hattie also often hosted the club meetings. Her house was located downtown at 621 West Charles Street at the corner of Charles and Garkey, not far from where she worked at the library. Programs that she hosted for the club included readings and discussions on topics related to science, history, music, biographies, political issues, and social questions. Hattie herself must have had an interest in ancient history and archaeology. The newspaper published an article about her personal collections, including a Roman coin dating back 1,600 years and a fossil found in a 700-foot deep coal shaft. Next slide. In 1897, Hattie's husband passed away unexpectedly, and just 2 months later, a newly widowed Hattie continued to be involved with the Women's Club and hosted their 22nd anniversary meeting in her home. Next slide. Hattie herself died in 1922, having lived long enough to see the 19th Amendment grant women the right to vote in 1920. She was buried in Beech Grove Cemetery with her husband. For decades, Hattie had served the Muncie community by providing access to research and reading materials, as well as facilitating intellectual discussions and the advancement of women and betterment of the community. And that's Hattie.
Thank you, Sarah. Are there any questions? Please go ahead and place them in the chat, or if you want to ask your question vocally, you can just raise your hand by clicking the blue hand button in the participants bar, and I'll look through and see if anyone pops up. It doesn't look like we have any questions, so we'll go ahead and go on to the next presenter.
Okay, well, I didn't know if you were going to introduce me. This is Melissa.
Oh, sorry.
Gentry.
This is Melissa Gentry. She will be talking about Louise Nelson Cassidy.
Thank you. Next slide, please. The first graduating class of the Muncie Central Academy, what would later become Muncie Central High School, was comprised of only 7 women in 1868. Here's a historic photograph of 3 of those 7 students. Next slide. Classes were conducted in the basement of the Unitarian Universalist Church. Apparently, it was a new trend to conduct commencement exercises for high schools. So the schools quickly evaluated its students, and only girls, none of the boys, qualified to graduate. Next slide. I remember reading Little House on the Prairie and thinking school was probably so easy back then, you know, just reading, writing, and arithmetic. But these Muncie students were drilled on trigonometry, chemistry, astronomy, zoology, physics, rhetoric, algebra, geometry, geology, and the languages, including Latin. Next slide. The 7 sweet girl graduates, as they were called by the newspapers, were Flora V. Anthony, Frone Case, Mary Craig, Ida Houston, Lizzie Montgomery, Rose Ross, and Louise Nelson. I like to call them the OG, or the original graduates. Next slide. The commencement was held at Walling Hall across the street from the courthouse and was described as one rivaling a college graduation in its beauty and the quality of the speeches. And Walling Hall is the pink building just to the left of that star on the north arrow. Next slide. Each one of these young graduates became lifelong advocates for not just women, but for the betterment of their communities. Frone Case became an advocate for disadvantaged youths in Marion. Flo Anthony established schools for the children of workers at her family orange farm in Florida. And Ida Houston Harper, shown here, dedicated her life to the cause of women's suffrage and was selected by Susan B. Anthony to write her biography. Next slide. And this tight-knit girl squad and the following class of 1869 remained friends for life. This picture was taken at the 25th class reunion held at Louise Nelson's house. Ida Houston Harper said in a speech that night, quote, "If any of us have thought that we had become worldly wise, cynical, indifferent, beyond the weakness of sentiment, this resurrection of the past, this reunion of the loved ones so long separated, has undeceived us," unquote. Next slide. So tonight's focus is Margaret Louise Nelson Cassidy, or Lou, born in 1850 to Robert and Sarah Fraser Boyd Nelson. Next slide. The Nelson family settled in Muncie just before the Civil War. In fact, Lou's 2 brothers fought for the Union. This is her brother, Derastus Wildey Nelson. Next slide. At Muncie Central Academy, Lou was the editor of the Rose Leaf, school newspaper, which was really more literary essays than news stories. Lou's speech on graduation day was titled "No Cross, No Crown." The implied message is the old-fashioned version of "no pain, no gain." One of Lou's friends recalled, quote, "From the time she came to Muncie as a young girl, she at once was a favorite among her schoolmates and with her teachers until she became a teacher herself, both in public schools and in Sunday school, where she gained the love of her pupils," unquote. Lou had actually acquired a teacher's license in October of 1866 at age 16, almost 2 years before she graduated. Following graduation, Lou first taught at a county school and later at the Jefferson School in Muncie. Next slide. Her friend continued about Lou, quote, "In social life, she held an enviable place. There was a charm of personality which attracted many friends," unquote. She also attracted a successful businessman, an eligible bachelor who was actually a member of a Muncie group called the Old Bachelors Club, or OBC, which was established in 1858 by men professing to remain single. In 1871, after his 13-year membership in the OBC, John Van Horn, or J.V.H. Cassidy, married OG Lou Nelson. He was 12 years her senior and a member of one of Muncie's pioneering families. Next slide. Cassidy had taken over his father's drugstore and then began selling dishes and other fancy items in his downtown store. Next slide. The couple eventually made their home at 411 West Adams Street, which still exists today. Early in their marriage in 1878, Ida Houston Harper gave the commencement address at Muncie Central High School. Harper later tattled that Lou's husband, John, was not exactly a fan of her speech that day. Quote, "Incidentally, I advocated for the enfranchisement of women. At the close of the exercises, my old friend John Cassidy said, 'How could you spoil that excellent speech with a reference to women's suffrage?'" Unquote. Next slide. It's difficult for us to understand today, but objections to women leaving the house to form clubs were common, and many of the women kept their attendance secret from their husbands and fathers. But Lou never let her husband's opinions prevent her from joining forces with other women for the good of Muncie. Lou was a founding member of at least 5 different clubs. Pictured here is the Edith Love Bicycle Club. Next slide. Lou was a charter member of the Muncie Matinee Musicale. She called for the creation of the Federated Clubs of Muncie and served on its state board. And Lou was a member of the Presbyterian Church and helped to create its missionary society and was active in its choir. Next slide. But Lou's favorite club was one that she founded with her Girl Squad. The original graduates of Muncie Central Academy founded a women's club in 1876. Next slide. But Lou was more than just a charter member. She was that club's biggest champion. According to a friend, quote, "Louise felt the wish for self-improvement, finding the opportunity when the women's club was organized. A sincere interest in the club's progress was evident from the first. She took an active part in all proceedings, served wherever there was a place unfilled, welcomed the club to her home for many meetings. She kept a scrapbook for clippings about club events, and in her reading, she always caught sight of any hint for club betterment or enjoyment," unquote. After leading the club for years, Lou was elected President Emeritus for life. In 1926, Louise Nelson Cassidy presented a speech at the 50th anniversary celebration of the club. She discussed the brave efforts of Susan B. Anthony and how even forming a women's club was met with ridicule, suspicion, and, quote, "hue and cry from husbands and the weekly paper," unquote. Lou again declared, quote, "You may be sure it took rare courage for a little group of women to band themselves together to form a," unquote. Next slide. Margaret Louise Nelson Cassidy would pass away only months after this celebration of 50 years of her beloved club. But her speech about the purpose and evolution of the Women's Club also serves as a fitting tribute to her own life and the lives of those OGs of the Muncie Central Academy. Here's part of Lou's last and lasting speech. "So the little band of women plodded on, slowly feeling their way with not even a definite plan, only realizing that they were seeking to develop ideals, seeking power of expression and self-improvement. I remember one meeting when the cry of fire was heard. Now, a fire in those days meant considerable excitement. We were each personally interested in some member of the volunteer fire department, so we all jumped up and ran to the fire, much to the disgust of our president, Miss Jenny Neely, who said we behaved like a bunch of school children. With the discovery of natural gas in our city and the resulting boom, many women who were experienced in club work in other cities increased our membership, and the club moved forward with great enthusiasm, accomplishing much of the real and lasting benefit. Next slide. So we grew and grew, and as we reached an age of maturity and dignity, we laid aside our crude beginnings and began to feel that club life was not only a privilege, but an obligation, and that we should not be content with self-development, but should be a power for good in the community. The Muncie Morning Star called Lou's life useful and described her as a pioneer in all movements for women's advancement. And uncharacteristically for the time, the newspapers mentioned her club work and not the name of her late husband. I think Lou would be fine with that.
Thank you, Melissa. Are there any questions? Okay, seeing as there's none, we're going to move on to Lindsey Vesperry, and she's going to talk about Edith Elizabeth Kirby Barnes.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So, like she said, my segment of this presentation focuses on Edith Elizabeth Kirby Barnes. Next slide, please. Some of you may recognize the name Kirby. It's a rather ubiquitous name in the Muncie area. Some may know of Kirby Avenue in the east side of the city. There's also the Kirby Historic District, the old Kirby Hotel, and of course the Kirby Wood Lumber Company here in Muncie. I tend to consider them the predecessor of the Ball family, one of the more notable business families in the area before the Ball brothers arrived in Muncie around 1886. We received a donation of Edith Kirby's family papers last year from her descendants, which I was personally very excited about. I was familiar enough with the name Kirby and was happy to increase their representation in our archives. We are also beginning the process of digitizing her collection, so it will eventually be available digitally on our digital media repository. So of course, Edith was a member of this Kirby family. She was born January 21st, 1875 in Muncie to Thomas Hickman Kirby and Anna Cassidy Kirby. Next slide. Her father, Thomas Hickman, co-founded the Kirby Lumber Company in 1899 with his brother, John Kirby. After his death in 1911, Edith's husband, Robert D. Barnes Sr., was named president of the lumber company, a role he fulfilled until his death in 1935. Her son, Robert D. Barnes Jr., took on the role after his father's passing. Next slide. Edith's paternal grandfather was Thomas Kirby, who was one of the first European-American pioneers to settle here in Muncie. Thomas Kirby is well known for erecting the longest standing building here in Delaware County. It was built around 1839 and is located at 1353 East Jackson Street within the boundaries of the Kirby Historic District. It still stands today, although it is in private ownership and is now difficult to see from the side of the road due to some of the overgrowth. Next slide. Like most women of her class in this time period, Edith was involved in local women's clubs and societies. She makes frequent appearances in the society pages of local Muncie newspapers, generally attending card games, teas, and luncheons. A notable club that Edith took part in was the Harlequins, which was organized at her home in 1892. According to this article on the screen, it was a club for old maids. And apparently none of the members could marry after they hit the age of an old maid. Whatever that age was, it actually doesn't say in this article. Ironically, her father, Thomas Hickman Kirby, was also formed an Old Bachelors Club, which you noticed earlier in Melissa's presentation. He was a member of that club as well. He formed it with 7 other Muncie men in 1853 or 1858. And of course, as Melissa said earlier, they vowed to never marry. One could imagine that Edith may have been inspired by her father's club to form the Old Maids Club. Next slide. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, Thomas Hickman married Edith's mother, Anna Cassidy, who, interestingly enough, was a sister of fellow Old Bachelors Club members William J.V.H. Cassidy and John J.V.H. Cassidy. As you heard from Melissa, John V.H. married Louise Nelson Cassidy, which makes Louise Edith's aunt. Thomas and Anna were married in 1862 when Thomas was 28 years old. In similar fashion, Edith eventually married Robert D. Barnes Sr. in 1900 when she was 25 years old. So by most standards, she was a little older than most women who married during the turn of the century. Another interesting tidbit is that the children of Louise Nelson Cassidy were part of Edith and Robert's wedding party. Arthur Cassidy is on the left. He's the man in the mustache with the mustache to the far left. And Vita Cassidy, Janie, is the woman furthest to the right. Edith Kirby is in the middle here. She has the veil, of course. And Robert Barnes, her husband, is the third man from the right. Edith and Robert would have 2 children together, Robert D. Barnes Jr. and Anne Cassidy Barnes, who died in infancy. After their wedding, the newlyweds moved to Robert's hometown of Colorado Springs, where he was involved with his family's hardware store business. They returned to live in Muncie in 1906. Next slide. Edith was also active in the Daughters of the American Revolution, Paul Revere chapter here in Muncie. She filled elected positions such as historian, registrar, and chaplain. Edith also took part in the DAR's celebration of National Constitution Day, where members studied the Constitution and encouraged the community to engage with the Constitution as well. Next slide. Edith was also active in promoting the Republican Party of Muncie, and she was also part of the local Delta Theta Tau chapter. She frequently helped Delta Theta Tau of Muncie raise funds for a low-income school in the Kentucky Appalachian Mountains. She was also involved when her church, the Grace Episcopal Church, which is located at the southeast corner of Madison and Adams Street. In her spare time, she also enjoyed doing family genealogy research and traveling across the U.S. and across the world. Next slide. Near the end of her life, Edith spent her time working towards the local World War II effort, volunteering at Muncie's rationing board at North Mulberry Street. While there, she partook in various functions of the board, including handing out ration books and distributing supplies and food. She also spent time with her son, Robert D. Barnes Jr., his wife, Louise Howard Barnes, and her 3 grandchildren. She passed away on August 27th, 1943, before she could see the end of the war. And that is all I have for now on Edith Kirby, a very abridged version of her life.
Thank you, Lindsay. Are there any questions? It looks like we do have a question in the chat. Melissa, I think this will be for you. Where did the photographs of Louise Nelson come from? I was interested in the groups and the Civil War pictures.
Oh, the Nelson Cassidy family collection in the digital media repository. If you get on the Ball State University Library's main page on the right-hand side, if you scroll down, it will say digital media repository. And there's a collection, I believe it's called the Nelson Cassidy Family Collection. And it has photographs and letters, all different kinds of things that you can see.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, we're now going to move on to Sarah's going to come back and give us a talk about Nettye Parsons Riffe.
Okay, yes, so next slide, please. So Nettye Riffe was born Nettye Edith Pierson in 1882 in Marion, Indiana, and grew up in Muncie. She attended Jackson School as a child and then Muncie High School. That's her circled in the class photo from 1902 from the Muncie High School yearbook. She was one of 2 African-American students in her class that year. Next slide. Nettye was strikingly beautiful and refined, and as far as I can tell, she was one of few African-Americans to be featured with a photograph in the Muncie newspapers in the early 1900s. Not only was Nettye sophisticated and beautiful, but the newspaper described her as one of the bright young women in her class. For a reception and dance that her class sponsored, the newspapers back then described the dresses that each of the girls wore to the event. Nettye's was silk muslin and trimmed with all-over lace and green velvet ribbon. Green and white were her junior class colors. Next slide. In 1905, her marriage was announced in the newspapers. Nettye married Luther Riffe, another well-known member of the local African-American community, and they moved in with her parents who lived on South Plum Street, which I think according to the census was renamed Pershing Drive, but the house is no longer there. Nettye was described as a highly respected young woman and prominent in church circles. Her parents and husband worked as custodians for the post office and a bank at this time, and her husband later became a family's private chauffeur. Next slide. In 1917, Nettye's mother, Josephine Pierson, was one of the founders of Muncie's local Booker T. Washington Franchise League, which was the African-American Women's Suffrage League. Josephine was vice president of the league, and Nettye was actively involved. In 1926, Nettye continued her work for the betterment of women in the community by co-founding Muncie's Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YWCA, which opened on First Street. Often the YWCA branches for African-American women were named in tribute after Phyllis Wheatley, a former slave who became one of the best-known poets of the 19th century. Nettye became secretary of the branch, and her office was located on the second floor of the building, which was a former residential property. Sometime either before or after she opened the branch, Nettye enrolled for 2 summers in Wellesley College in Massachusetts to study social welfare. She also attended numerous trainings at YWCA institutions and even went on to attend classes at Ball State College. As secretary of the YWCA, she was often a guest speaker at conferences and events. Nettye utilized her training to focus on helping girls become well-rounded contributing members of society. She eventually became executive director of the Phyllis Wheatley YWCA in Muncie. Next slide. During Nettye's 20-year tenure at the YWCA, membership grew to nearly 400 girls. When Nettye died in 1951, the loss was felt in the community. The newspaper reported that Muncie had lost one of its outstanding women. Next slide. In 1953, the First Street Center YWCA held a memorial program for Nettye where they spoke of her admirable character and service to the community. In 1955, they planted a tree in her honor. Nationally, in 2009, the YWCA's mission statement was adopted that the YWCA is dedicated to eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And I think this was true of Nettye's work here in Muncie. And that's what I have for Nettye.
Thank you, Sarah. Are there any questions? Okay, we're going to move on. Okay, so we're going to jump about 50 years into the future and talk about a woman who contributed to both the local community and to the community of Ball State. Althea Stoeckel was a professor of history at Ball State University from 1960 until her death in 1978. She was born in Bunker Hill, Illinois, attended Shirley College, and was a public school teacher. After 4 years of teaching, she returned to higher education and received her master's degree and PhD in history from the University of Illinois. She specialized in 18th century history and, more specifically, the American Revolution. In December of 1966, the Delaware County Courthouse was slated to be demolished. Althea heard that once all the current working files and other material had been removed from the courthouse, a demolition company offered for sale fixtures and other items not to be transferred to the new building. As a true historian, Althea made her way to the sale and looked around at the different types of physical items that had been left behind. She discusses this whole adventure in her lecture entitled Cleo in the Attic. Quote, I made my way downtown on the day of the sale to look at such antique items as iron stair rails, walnut doors, brass doorknobs, cherry desks, stained glass, and marble panels. During the course of browsing over the stripped building, I climbed to the attic of the 4th floor and there found an area of some 9 large rooms with a uniform appearance. Leather-bound ledgers and papers, 10 file boxes, wooden cases of papers, and loose documents lying about in complete chaos. The attic had obviously been a storage place from the first opening of the courthouse in the 1880s. And during all these years, little care had been taken to keeping things clean or in order. It looked like an attic in many old homes, only much worse, and now the curious had rummaged through the rooms, strewing the contents of file boxes about and tossing ledgers hither and thither. Over and through this incredible disorder was dust, and attic dust at that. Althea quickly organized fellow colleagues to save these records. Dean Richard Burkhart gave permission for the use of a university truck, and 10 men from the university grounds crew helped with packing and moving the material. In all, they had only 6 days before the building was to be demolished. Now, this may sound like a lot of time, but the material was in the attic. The power in the building had been cut off, and the elevators were not working. After the first day, it was clear that moving the large ledgers was taking more time, given the need for the crew to rest from going up and down the stairs. Additionally, on the first day, they also found more material in the basement that was just as full as the attic. On the second day, the university crew had rigged a pulley system to move the ledgers from the attic straight into the moving truck in the hopes of moving the material faster. Additionally, packing supplies were provided by the bookstore, and additional help arrived from undergraduates and graduate students, and different campus fraternities had sent teams of pledges to assist. In 5 days, and a small but mighty snowstorm, the material from the courthouse was saved and moved to Ball State. Althea's lecture, Cleo in the Attic, is a fun read with more detail about the adventures of saving the Delaware County Archive and how she developed laboratory classes around sorting and processing the material as a way to teach freshman history students the importance of local history and research. There is a digital copy in the digital media repository if anyone is interested. While Althea may be known now for saving the Delaware County Archive, she also provided a large contribution to the Ball State community. In 1974, Althea was asked by Dean Richard Burkhart to chair the Women's Studies Committee at Ball State University. By 1975, the committee had been given formal recognition. At this time, women's studies programs were developing slowly at colleges and universities across the country. Now, as second-wave feminism, broadened the discussion of a wider range of women's issues, including sexuality, family, the workplace, reproductive rights, and inequality were starting to take shape. The committee began to work to develop a women's studies minor. 3 years earlier, the first course in Women's Studies, ID 210, was taught in the spring of 1972. It was an interdisciplinary course that was created and taught by a team of 3 professors who worked together. Betty Newcomb of the English department, and very active in the League of Women Voters, and one of the organizers of the Muncie, Delaware County chapter of the National Organization for Women. Marie Vogel from the Sociology Department, and Sharon Seeger of the History Department. By the beginning of 1974, soon after ID 210 had been added to the curriculum, other departments at Ball State began creating courses in women's studies. By 1975, 2 additional courses were in existence and 9 were under consideration. These included Culture and Women in Anthropology, Women in Politics and Political Science, and Women of Ancient Greece and Rome and Classical Cultures. In 1975, the Student Center Governing Board, with support from the Women's Studies Committee, developed a proposal for a special event to commemorate the celebration of Women's Year. The United Nations General Assembly declared 1975 to be International Women's Year, and the first UN World Conference on Women was held in Mexico City from June 19th to July 2nd. In December, Ball State University commemorated the year with International Women's Week. The week-long event had local speakers, seminars, and films to educate and celebrate women in the world. 3 major speakers, including Florence Kennedy, an African-American lawyer, feminist, and civil rights activist who was known as the Black Queen of the women's movement, Warren Farrell, who was the author of The Liberated Man, who was an organizer of the first national conference on the masculine mystique in 1974, and Caroline Bird, who was the author of Born Female, The High Cost of Keeping Women Down. In an opinion piece in the Ball State Daily News, writer Cokie Walter discussed the upcoming event along with the national attention around women's rights. Quote, "While Ball State's efforts might not change the world's attitudes about women and their contribution to the situation, it is highly commendable start for an institution that still does not give women keys to outside doors of residence halls." The minor in Women's Studies was approved in December of 1980, and enrollment in the program started in 1981. Throughout the 1990s, the program continued to grow. By the early 2000s, courses included international women's issues, feminist theory, European women writers, and women in American history. In 10 years, the program saw an increase in student enrollment from 27 to over 100 by 2001. At this time, the Women's Studies Curriculum Committee began to develop a proposal for an undergraduate major in Women's Studies. By 2004, the Ball State University catalog had added the major, and by that time, Women's Week was an annual event in March, which hosted guest speakers as Eleanor Smeal, Betty Friedan, Judy Collins, and Gloria Steinem. From 1974 to 1978, Althea chaired the Women's Studies Committee. As chairperson, the committee reviewed and approved the additional women's studies courses, started what would become the first Women's Week, and developed the proposal for the Women's Studies minor. Althea Stoeckel died unexpectedly in December of 1978. During her 18 years of service as a professor of history at Ball State University and a member of the Muncie community, she contributed so much. She saved the Delaware County archives and used them to teach her students about the importance of local history while immersing them in the material. At this time, this was a new approach to education, one that faculty, librarians, and archivists continue today. For her service and contribution, the Ball State University Board of Trustees unanimously voted to rename the local history archive of the Special Collections Department in her honor after her passing. Today, the Ball State University Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections Stoeckel Archive of Local History is named for her. As the chairperson of the Women's Studies Committee, she spearheaded the development of a minor and continued to support the development of a women's studies program at Ball State. In her honor, the Women's and Gender Studies Department has a Distinguished Service Award in her name. The Althea Stoeckel Award for Distinguished Service was established in 1991 and is given as a symbol of enduring friendship and recognition of outstanding contributions towards the goals of the Women's Studies program at Ball State. It is awarded annually to a student, staff, faculty, administrator, or community member who has continuously made support of the Women's Studies program a high priority. So that's the end of our presentation. We would like to thank you for joining us this evening, and we are happy to answer any questions you might have.